We have some passages to look at. If you look at the objective of the lesson and study who, where, and when the Dead Sea Scrolls and what their discoveries meant to understanding the transmission of the Old Testament canon. And I do want us to look at these passages very quickly in the understanding, as we've done some of this before, that in the days of, from the time of the birth of Christ, John the Baptist, and then the ministry of Jesus, that the Old Testament was very, very much apparent and fluid, that there were numerous copies of the Old Testament, and we must appreciate that even during a period of 400 years of silence, from the last Old Testament book of Malachi until the emergence of John the Baptist, even though there was 400 years of prophetic silence and there were no other prophetic books written, the Bible, the Old Testament that was available, had multiple copies. And this great discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as a matter of fact, it's now understood quite convincingly that these Dead Sea Scrolls were written during this intertestamental period of time between the covenants of the Old and the New. And the biggest theory, the most embraced theory, is that it was done by a sect by the name of the Essenes, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what I want us to see that as we look at Scripture in Matthew chapter 3, and what they have here in this outline is, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, this is John the Baptist, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee the wrath to come? Bear fruit in keeping with repentance. And do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children from Abraham, for Abraham. Even now the axe is laid at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." Now just keep in mind that what had been going on for a number of years is that there were some Jewish sects that had become leaders within the Jewish community. And the question becomes, how effectively were they dealing with the law? And of course, they were not dealing with the law accurately at all. In fact, this is when Jesus would expose it. If you just flip a page, one of the examples, when you go to Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount and drop down to verse 17, Jesus then would say, and this is relatively a short period of time after John makes his comment. John has his ministry preparing the way for Christ. Now Christ has started his ministry. But in Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until it is all accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So not only do we see that both John the Baptist and Jesus expose the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and their treatment of the law, but what is it that Jesus himself says about the law and the prophets? What is Jesus' posture or stance concerning the law and the prophets? How would you answer that, somebody?
Let them know that the things that you've read about, that's what I'm here to fulfill, the things that the prophets have said beforehand.
So first of all, this law, these prophets, and these writings were very present, had been present, and they were very familiar with them. And even though the scribes and the Pharisees would abuse them, Jesus is showing that he's going to fulfill that which they had had. It had been a part of their history for a long time. And then he says, to what extent about changing? What was the warning he gave in changing any part of the law of the prophets? What expressions did he use? Yeah, a jot and a tittle. If you notice in the ESV, an iota, even the superscript of the iota typically is an I in Greek, but there is a marking, a diacritical marking in the Hebrew of iota, just a little marking. And we know that in the stroke of the pen in the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabet, that those strokes are very important as to what letters and so forth are being represented. But Jesus is showing this which has been in existence for some time. They have a responsibility not to change it, not a bit. Okay? And this is how he's going to see the value of that. Now stay there in Matthew and go to chapter 12, if you would please. Matthew chapter 12. And drop on down to verse number 38. And in Matthew chapter 12, and verse 38, then some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered him, that is Jesus saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Behold, something greater than Solomon is here. By the way, what is it that was greater than Solomon and greater than the sign of Jonah? Jesus himself. In the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies of which the law and the prophets spoke, but the scribes and the Pharisees and many of the Jewish leaders of the day, they were not accepting Jesus. Did they have access to the law and the prophets, and could they see Jesus completely fulfill these things? Absolutely. What we're trying to present here is a picture of the existence of the law and the prophets that had been there for centuries. For centuries. Multiple copies of it. For centuries. Some of the copies that they had that they probably read from could have been decades, perhaps even a century old or better. But as there were multiple copies being made. Okay. Then if you go to Matthew chapter 22, and when you see the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees trying to trip up Jesus and find some fault in him, you find here in chapter 22, beginning at verse 15, you have these discussions, first of all, paying taxes to Caesar, and the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. This is verse 15. And they sent the disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, for you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said, Whose likeness is inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. I want to ask you, how do they know what the things that are God's are? How do they even know what the things that are of God? From the declared law of God. The law had been revealed. The law had been written. The prophets had prophesied. Those prophecies had been written. We've got to understand that at this period of time, did they have copies of Isaiah? Did they have copies of Jeremiah? Did they have copies of Hosea? We were in our study with Annette today and went right through one in Matthew chapter 2 and in one of the direct quotations of Hosea, and that how he would come out of Egypt. And they had copies of all of these. But yet, and we're not going to read all the rest of this but we understand that you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they're trying to trip up Jesus. I will say this, remember when the Sadducees asked about the resurrection, and they set up this hypothetical situation. Here is a woman that had all these husbands, but one husband after another died. And finally, the seventh husband dies, and they ask the question, whose wife shall she be in the resurrection? What was the hypocrisy about them? What was the hypocrisy that the Sadducees would ask Jesus that question? They didn't even believe in resurrection. But do you remember what Jesus' response was to them? Look at what he says in verse 29. He answered them, "You are wrong because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God." And then he goes on to say, for resurrection, there's not going to be marriage in heaven and so forth. But what I want us to see, that they were in error because they did not know the Scriptures nor the power of God. Did they have the ability, did they have access again to know the Scriptures? They were so accessible. They were very accessible. Multitudes of copies of them. And this is the picture that is portrayed over and over again. Turn over to Luke chapter 7, please. In Luke chapter 7. And now drop on down to verse 37. And 36, the paragraph begins, because it says in Luke 7, and at verse number 37, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And behold, a woman of the city, who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner." Let me ask you first of all, did they in fact know and embrace the fact that there were true legitimate prophets of God? But they're questioning Jesus, of course. And so when you look at this, Jesus answers in verse 40, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And he answered, "Say it, teacher." A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon answered, "The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt." And he said to him, "You have judged rightly." Then turned toward the woman and he said, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. She gave me no water for my feet, but she wet my feet with tears and wiped with her hair." And he goes on and on about how she cared for him. He again is exposing, who do you think knew the law and the prophets better? This woman who is wiping the feet of Jesus and anointing Jesus, or the Pharisees asking the question, who are the doctors of the law? Who are the ones most familiar with the law and the prophets? And yet here's a simple woman who is acknowledging who Jesus is, and here the scribes and the Pharisees, this sect that for the larger part has totally ignored the available Scripture. Now, we see this, these are just a few examples, so it brings to these quick questions. So overall, what did the Pharisees think of Jesus? How would you answer that? What did the Pharisees think of Jesus? Somebody tackle that question. Tom?
I think they were confused because they knew what he could do, but they didn't fit their mold of what they wanted him.
So the confusion was because they ignored the facts of the very law that they could quote, the prophets that they could quote at length, but with their preconceived ideas or notions about the Messiah, Jesus didn't fit that mold. But now this comes to honesty of heart dealing with Scripture. Anybody have anything they want to add to that? I think that's a very fair analysis. Okay. So 2, what did Jesus think of the Pharisees? Yes, he called them for that. Now, does that mean he didn't love them? No, we know better than that. But he exposes their hypocrisy. And so, by the way, so we have the scribes, we have the Pharisees, we saw the Sadducees in numerous places, but in Matthew 22. Now, I ask, does the Bible, in the gospel text or anywhere in the Bible, old or new, does it mention the Essenes? No, it doesn't. So from a biblical standpoint, it does not mention the Essenes, and history seems to bear out that by this time, the Essenes could have very well have been pretty much have died out, or there were so very few of them, perhaps held up in certain places and trying to live non-Roman influenced lives, that they're not coming into interaction with Jesus during his ministry. But historically, And we know this from various historical writings, even of Josephus, who speaks of scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees. He also speaks of the Essenes. And we have other historical documentation that speaks of the Essenes, which is another Jewish religious sect. Okay? And it's just they're not mentioned. Now, we're going to see that somebody took the time during this intertestamental period of time, from the end of the Old Testament, Malachi, to the emergence, the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, of a period of time, again, of some 400 years, there was a ton of Old Testament being written down, preserved, recorded by scribes. A ton. And that's going to bring us to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, by the way, so with these definitions, we know the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and we know these two very important religious sects, and the Sanhedrin Council was made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees, more Sadducees than Pharisees, and the Sadducees were extremely wealthy, even more wealthy for the most part than the Pharisees. Very influential. Pharisees are the doctors of the law, but nothing said in the New Testament about the Essenes, but we know their historical existence. What about the Zealots? Do we have any mention of Zealots within the New Testament? What was his name, Ellen? Simon the Zealot, who Jesus picked to be one of the apostles, one of the original disciples. Why were they called? This was another sect. Why were they called Zealots?
Politically active and against the Roman rule.
Absolutely.
Zealous
for their Jewish faith and their Jewish culture and customs. And just as anti-Roman or anti-Gentile, so to speak, as anybody or anything. Which is interesting as a side note. When Jesus chose the original 12, he chooses Simon the Zealot, who's going to have that personality trait, and he's going to have them work side by side from time to time, evidently with Matthew. And what was Matthew? A tax collector for Romans. Now that's interesting to me that Jesus would pick and have those two have them to be disciples and to work side by side. But we don't have a lot of information in the New Testament about the Zealots. We have some. But what we're trying to portray here is a period of history that the Old Testament is very present. And we saw it already in a couple of the passages we just read that referred to the scriptures, in the Greek, the graphia, the scriptures. So again, contextually, when the Gospels or even the epistles refer to the scriptures, in most cases the scriptures refer to what? The Old Testament, right? Now sometimes it may refer to the Hebrew Old Testament, sometimes it referred to an Aramaic Old Testament, and sometimes it referred to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But the scriptures, so often in the New Testament, refer to the Old Testament scriptures from Genesis through Malachi. Now, okay, that kind of gives us that background. Now, when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're just going to follow along, and I've got a lot of things I want to add to this, but we're just going to kind of go through this outline here for us that we have before us. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have been called the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. I would dare say that the Dead Sea Scrolls were the greatest find of the 20th century. The greatest find of the 20th century. They were discovered between 1947 and 1956 in 11 caves along the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. In fact, I just want to go ahead and show this. And so, as we would notice, we have two maps here. But first of all, as we would notice here we have the Dead Sea. Now, the Sea of Galilee is to the north with the Jordan River running down, and the Jordan River ending at the Dead Sea. And then the Dead Sea basically stops there. There's some water that goes out, but what's the water factor of the Dead Sea?
Salt.
Yeah, saltine. I mean, it is, and so very much kind of like the Salton Sea that we have in the North American continent. And so we understand now the northwest shoreline would be there, and about a mile west of that shoreline is this area where is a lot of cliffs and these caves and a multiplicity. So when you come down to here to get proximity of things, here's the Dead Sea. We're talking about the northwest shore. Look, here's the city of Jerusalem, not all that far, because as we look, when we're looking at this whole area, do you understand that this whole area is not even as big as the state of California? California's a pretty big state, but it is considerably smaller, right? We kind of think of these countries, well, that's a whole country, and even today, we'll understand, by comparison, we recognize that Jerusalem was not too many miles from where the caves of Qumran would be found. And in fact, we'll just go ahead. And so these Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered initially in 1947. I have more to say about that. And that excavation and discovery would go through 1953 in exploring caves and even continuing to dig out very meticulously, clear into 1956. Don't think that they just found everything in 1947 in a matter of months. Look at all this stuff and start pulling it out in wheelbarrows. They did not do that. We're going to find out that Cave 4, there are 11 principal caves. Not too many years ago, they found a 12th cave. And in that 12th cave, there's only a little bit of material, and they're still trying to determine. Right now, they found a empty white blank scroll. But they're trying to see if there's any further information found within that cave. But in the 11 caves, for example, in the 4th cave, in fact, caves 3 and 4 were meticulously being explored in 1952 and 1953, and Cave 4 had the most amount of biblical literature in it. Literally hundreds of scrolls and manuscripts and thousands of fragments in Cave 4 alone. In fact, Cave 4 itself has almost the majority of the Old Testament text. Now, mind you, and that was being worked on and discovered in 52 and 53, when in 47 is when they found the first cave, Cave 1, which, by the way, contained, anybody know what valuable scroll was found in Cave 1? Huh? Isaiah scroll, exactly, White. The complete Isaiah scroll. And then in Cave 2, there was a large segment or fragment of Isaiah as well. We'll talk about that more. But that became the oldest copy of Isaiah that we had. Before that, it was the Masoretic text of the 9th century A.D. Okay? So I want us to understand that with them going through, and they were doing it in bad ways, by the way, as far as their science and the ways that they were doing it. It was not until 1991 they finally decided to put it on the right kind of cardboard, put it between glass. They finally, with a cardboard, a non-acid cardboard, in controlled temperature rooms. Some of us have gone up to Hearst Castle, where some of you have worked, and how important is it for the artwork and the antiquities there to have controlled climate, right? And you understand, and I'm going to show you some pictures here in a little bit, it's going to blow your mind, of what they were doing and how they were exploring these things. And about at least 5% of the biblical literature has been lost to just mishandling. 5%. Thankfully not 95%. But wait.
Well, over the years, in conservation, like even up at the castle, they did things that was the state of the art.
Right.
But over the years, those things had to be undone because they were actually detrimental, more detrimental than what they originally had done.
Amen. In fact, let me see when this is coming up, because I can always come back. I just want to show you this, and we're going to back up again. So when you go back to the 1940s, even the 1950s, There is started traveling with the scrolls not too many miles away, just east of Jerusalem, so kind of in between where they were found and then before you get to Jerusalem. And they built these long huts, and they would have these long tables. And I have actually pictures, and a better picture, and a couple of guys sitting at these tables, and they're smoking cigarettes over this dry material. And because for lighting, they've got this natural sunlight that is coming through these windows, and they would leave everything exposed there all day long. Now understand, when we back up again and we think that's fascinating there, wrong way. I'll get it right in a minute. Let's go this way. Here, let's go here. Let's stay here. So this is what I want. Trust me, this is what I want. Because we look at these, and you can't tell here, but about how tall do you think some of these clay vessels were? Yeah, about 3 feet. Some of them up to 4 feet. And so you have these different. So as we talked about before, what kind of climate are we talking about?
Dry.
Extremely arid, dry climate. In caves, no direct sunlight. Scrolls put into the clay jars, most of them having lids on them. And for 2,100 years at least, not opened or touched by anybody, no exposure, even the exposure of no humidity, no sunlight, all of those things. And it's amazing of how well preserved many of them were. And yet once they took them out and started studying them, they started deteriorating rapidly. That point.
Well, light is cumulative, so whatever happens, you expose it to light, it just continues to deteriorate.
Right.
The other thing is, even at work, because of the nature of the rooms, like in the library, you have so many different artifacts, you always wanted to keep the papers and books at a lower humidity, but we couldn't do that. So we did a half medium, but so they were in the proper environment.
They were
drier than.
And when you think about it for the time of being not nearly as scientific as we are today, at the time, they were being stored at the best optimum place imaginable. Now I look at that with one answer, and that's God's providence. And I look at it that they're not even discovered for 2,100 years. Because now as we have come into the 19th century and into the 20th century, well after the Industrial Revolution, and into an emergence of skepticism and cynicism when it comes to the belief in God and biblical literature, and that they're beginning to question the authenticity and the rumors, or rather the theories about the biblical writings. In fact, they believed, the highly educated people of the day in the 1800s and the early 1900s, they had come to the conclusion that the Old Testament was probably actually written in the early medieval times. Well, guess what? They missed it by centuries, particularly with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay? Go back to the paper. The bottom of page 47. This arid region, 13 miles east of Jerusalem and 1,300 feet below sea level. The Dead Sea Scrolls are comprised of the remains of approximately 825 to 870 separate scrolls, represented by tens of thousands of fragments. By the way, we know that these, again, looking at these, in fact, look at the middle picture. And as you look at the middle picture, what do you notice in this particular vessel here? Cracks. And so some of these, they meticulously put back together. Not that they're putting the scrolls back in them, but just so they could see them. But when you take, in the Old Testament, there's a common term, when a clay vessel breaks, and what are those pieces often called? Yeah, exactly. And potsherd. And they would sit, and if they had boils, or what would they do? They would take the shards of the potsherd and they'd scrape themselves. Sit in ashes. Sackcloth and ashes and scraping themselves. That was something very common. These were very common to have, and they were used for a lot of utilitarian purposes. I mean, they kept grain in them. When they sealed them correctly, they had water pots. But here these were designed. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, probably next week, when we talk about what's called the Great Temple Scroll. Because in the and that's just one little example of a part of the Temple Scroll. But the longest scroll of all of them, 25 feet long. When they rolled it out, 25 feet long. But the thinnest papyrus, the thinnest paper of all the scrolls. And it's that old. Can you imagine now what they're trying to do is unroll it? And the problems that was. And now the scientific means we can use by which to enhance what they're saying. I'm going to go back to this other one I showed a little bit ago here. And a previously unreadable fragment of one of the scrolls photographed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory using digital infrared technology, and for a long time, just through the eye and even using magnifying glasses or microscopes, they were not able really to tell what it was until they used this digital infrared technology and were able to clean it up and come up with this in this Hebrew expression. He wrote the words of Noah from this little piece. Now, can you imagine that's one little piece? Now, imagine you've got to do that to thousands of fragments. Is this giving us a better appreciation of the value of the scrolls and the work that was put into them that verifies the Old Testament, the biblical text? This is amazing. We'll just leave it there for a moment. I don't know which way I'm going to go next. But they're written with a carbon-based ink. Here's what they found. I was doing some reading today. And because now that they're able to, when you've got things where you can now chemically break things down, and especially things that are done on vellum and skins, and they knew, normally when you work vellum and these skins, and they would tan, you're talking about tanning hide, right? Tanning hide, and there's processes that they could use to tan the hide. A lot of times it might be just rubbing it, but they did not tan the hide, and what that did is that helped those scrolls not to deteriorate by not putting it through a tanning process. And for the ink, now they found out that they used the black carbon soot from oil-based lamps mixed with honey, water. Wait a minute. Where is that? What page was that? You gotta listen to this. This is just, here it is. So these black inks found carbon soot in these olive oil lamps. They know what it was now. Honey, oil, vinegar, and water. Added the mixture to give the ink a proper consistency for writing, and then used the reed pens. And imagine doing that, and when they did it on these untanned, and they were actually way ahead of their time in the way that they even prepared the vellum or the papyrus. And there's one copper scroll too. One copper scroll as well, only one. That even centuries later, they did not necessarily use those techniques. And there are things that are probably 1,000 years younger than the scrolls that were kept in relatively safe places that are not nearly in good a shape as the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think that's an accident either. Hoyt.
And honey has been used for many years as a preservative.
Okay.
And that's,
and that's something.
You think of all the
so honey and vinegar, it's amazing.
Yeah, but the honey has, and in fact they use it still today to protect the wound. I was watching the program today on the zoo animals. They were using honey.
You and your sister.
Well, correct.
Yeah, I know.
Ask Clint. He used to have to watch them all the time. He can't see them. But they used the honey as a protective, so things would not grow under the raw skin.
Yeah, fascinating.
It is.
It is just fascinating. Go to the next page, page 48. Do we have any other questions or comments while we're flipping the page here? Tom.
You said they. Are you saying that just the essence section is the
Essence.
one that did this? Essence. Are they the only ones that did this, or is this?
They're the ones. It is the most embraced theory is, and the history continues to really lean very heavily in favor that it certainly wasn't the Pharisees or the Sadducees. And it seems to be this earlier group of the Essenes, who had become very, very monastic. a monastery. And so as they went, now understand, historically, we're talking about Roman rule. Okay, when we look at our history, we're going to be transitioning from the final days of the Grecian Empire, Macedonia, and then until we have the Roman Empire. But regardless if it's a Grecian influence or Roman influence, you've got those that wanted to separate themselves completely, and these Essenes, and we have uncovered not far. I say we. I'd like to be over there and watch the archaeologists do it. But now they have uncovered a very significant village not far from, and it was under mounds of sand, not far from the caves of Qumran, that they now know that were inhabited by the Essenes, in almost this monastic lifestyle. And under that sand for years, they were able to dig up pottery and some other things, including like their own some other writings, even there in the little village. They had, I forget what it was. One was like a laundry list or something. It was amazing what they found. So we know that the Essenes were there. The timing is right. Their whole philosophy towards their Jewish culture and religion is right. To take these and to copy them and to protect them and to preserve them and hope that nobody would get to them so that the law and the prophets will be preserved. Now, it's not just biblical writings, but things that dealt with the entirety of their culture. That's amazing to me. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? Dennis, you have a kind of a okay, did you have a comment you want to make? Okay, somewhere in that area, there is wood burning. Is it Tim? I can see it. Okay, all right. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls can be divided into two categories, biblical and non-biblical. By the way, I wanted to share this with you. Oh, you still have 5 minutes, honey. Yeah, when you hear the bell, you got 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay. Is that what it is? Okay, I apologize. Let me just close with this. I apologize, honey. That was my bad. About 40% of the copies of text are Hebrew Scripture. About 30% are text from a Second Temple period, ultimately not canonized, but the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the book of Tobit, Wisdom, and by the way, Psalm 151 through 155. How many Psalms do we have? 150. But they found, now, they don't believe these were Davidic, but anyway. Okay, then the remainder, roughly 30%, are sectarian manuscripts of previously unknown documents, shed light on rules, beliefs of a particular group, probably the Essenes, and within greater Judaism, like the community rule, the war scroll, the Pesher of Habakkuk, which is a commentary, and the rule of blessing. So you've got that divided up of all kinds of writings. We got to stop. I can't believe that we're out of time. I cannot believe we're out of time. But there's more to come. We cannot spend just one session on the Dead Sea Scrolls. No way. Thank you very much.